and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, French President Emmanuel Macron is on a 3-day visit to the U.S., where he is expected to take up foreign policy with U.S. President Donald Trump. Could the French leader persuade Donald Trump to stay the course with the Iran deal, trade and security? And in celebration of Space Day, China unveils plans to beef up its brigade of taikonauts, spacemen and women, who will run the country's own space station in 2 years. And will China join the bandwagon of booming space tourism ventures? You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. A night of dinner and diplomacy, at least some diplomacy, for the American and French presidents. Emmanuel Macron is on a 3-day state visit to the U.S., the first foreign leader to receive such an honor from Donald Trump. But behind the ceremony, there are deep divisions, many say. Before our discussion on those, take a look at this.
Of all the world leaders, President Macron is known to have one of the closest relationships with U.S. President Trump, and the U.S. President laid on a lavish welcome for the French President and his wife. Reciprocation after Trump was feted in Paris last July, guest of a Bastille Day military parade, a sunset dinner at the Eiffel Tower, but then there was that epic near 30-second handshake too. The French President has tried to bond with Trump while other leaders in Europe have kept their distance.
We're very, very happy and honored to be here with my wife Brigitte at the invitation of President Trump and Melania.
But what has President Macron got out of the relationship? Not very much, it seems. The US President unilaterally withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, a snub to French diplomacy and France's commitment to the environment. And as the visit gets underway, the US is just 3 weeks away from potentially pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. Inked with France and other European powers plus China and Russia, this agreement limited Iran's nuclear activity and avoided a potential military clash. On the eve of his state visit, President Macron urged the US President to reconsider.
On nuclear, let's preserve this framework because it's better than a sort of North Korean type of situation.
For months, US diplomats have been pushing European allies to agree a side agreement with Iran, which would criticize Iran's behavior in the Middle East and address Tehran's ballistic missile program and other issues not covered by the agreement. But there is no guarantee the US President would even accept that. The White House says, don't expect a breakthrough on this trip. On Syria, France joined the US and the UK in the recent strikes against Syria in response to an alleged chemical weapons attack. But Trump says he wants to pull US troops out of Syria now that ISIL is largely defeated. On trade, the US has exempted temporarily the European Union from steel and aluminum tariffs. But the threat of US tariffs has created a hostile environment in Europe. Meanwhile, the US wants European help in pressuring China over market access and technology transfers. Macron has also domestic problems too. His popularity is plummeting in a France racked by strikes and resistance to unpopular reforms.
What can be achieved and what cannot during President Macron from France's trip to the United States? We are going to find out through our discussion with the 3 panelists. Here in Beijing, Wang Yiwei, who is the Jean Monnet Chair Professor and Director of the Center for European Studies at the Renmin University. Welcome, sir. In Paris, France, we are joined by Barthélemy Gourmand, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the French Institute of International and Strategic Affairs. And joining us in Washington, D.C., Paulo von Schirach, who is the President of Global Policy Institute. Gentlemen, I want to welcome all of you. Let me begin with you, Mr. Gourmand. Obviously, the French President is trying to show his, shall I say, appreciation of his host by even stepping down from the plane and speaking English. As you may know, French presidents in history seldom speak English, even though they could do it. So, what does it say? Closer relationship, no matter what?
Well, this is not the first time that Emmanuel Macron addresses in English in a very important speech. Remember, for instance, his reaction after Donald Trump announced his wish to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate change, And Emmanuel Macron made this video in English in which he urged the US president to change his position, and in which he also hoped for reaching an agreement with the American president. So this is some sort of a Macron style, you know, addressing important issues in English. Unlike his predecessors, this is a language that he can use very well, and therefore I'm not surprised personally that he did address in English as soon as he stepped in Washington, D.C.
Right.
On the other side, it is indeed a very important visit when it comes to the symbols, and this is one of them. The fact that the French president uses English to address the press as soon as he arrives in the United States is a very important symbol. This is, as you have mentioned in your program, the first state visit organized under the Trump presidency, and the fact that it is an honor for the French president is something extremely symbolic also.
All right. Well, it seems that the U.S. is trying to show something symbolic as well. Mr. Chirac, Mount Vernon is not everyone would go, right? It is where the George Washington actually have their residence there, and the dinner over there in Mount Vernon is quite interesting, isn't it? Some gesture as well.
Sure. Again, this is part of the choreography of this state visit, which again, as your previous guest indicated, is the very first state visit hosted by the Trump administration, and so it shows a ranking. It shows that Macron and France are very high on the list of preferred friends, if you wish, of the United States in Europe at this time. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, will come in a few days, and she will not get a state visit, and I'm sure people will notice that difference. So that aside, and indeed with all this pomp and circumstance, it remains to be seen what can actually be accomplished through these visits. The list of issues is very long.
Okay, let's begin with the Iran issue after all of these diplomatic readings. Iran issue. The United States wants to withdraw, particularly President Trump didn't want to stay in the area for long. And yet the French, of course, want to play a bigger role in that region and probably even beyond. They would love to have a partnership like the United States. So, Mr. Chirac, do you see there's any possibility that the two sides could reach any agreement? After all, it seems that U.S. strategic goal has been switched from the region to somewhere else.
Well, it seems that if you look at what Mr. Trump said, both during his campaign and in his first year of presidency, and even just a few weeks ago, before the punitive strike against Assad, which was really confined to his illegitimate use of chemical weapons, the United States has no strategy for Syria, no interest in continuing a presence aimed at reaching not quite clear diplomatic objectives. The presence in Syria, we should not forget, was focused entirely on defeating the caliphate, ISIL. And that goal has been largely accomplished. The United States has very little leverage in Syria, with about 2,000 trainers who support mostly Kurds. And that is a problem in itself. So I don't really see America changing its course on Syria.
What about Iran? That was actually my question.
Oh, sorry. Iran is a different story altogether. In Iran, there is obviously an American sort of aggressive stance that the deal that was struck largely under the auspices and support of the Trump administration and negotiated mostly by then Secretary of State John Kerry, it's a bad deal. And America would like to modify it somehow and withdraw from it, etc. But President Macron has indicated that there is no plan B. What if we do away with this treaty, then what? Then it's free for all, and Iran is free from any constraints. There is no better deal on the table, and it is really hard to see what America would accomplish by withdrawing from the agreement as signed by the Obama administration.
Well, you would argue that there will be a lot to be seen that what U.S. States could gain from withdrawing for all kinds of treaties. That probably is only one of those agreements that we are talking about among many. Mr. Gourmand, on the other hand, what will be the bottom line, you think, for France when it comes to the Iran issue? the role of the United States in the Iran issue?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, as it was said previously, there is no plan B, and Emmanuel Macron has been particularly clear on that. Yet, there are, of course, still several options on the table, and one of them is to try to convince Donald Trump of changing his opinion towards a nuclear deal. Another one could be to find some sort of compromise on another deal. Let's face it, this is not something that we can completely exclude, and we have seen in the past few weeks some change of attitudes totally regarding in particular the situation in Syria. I remind you that Donald Trump announced first that he was willing to withdraw its troops from Syria, and then he did participate to his operation a couple of weeks ago. So there are still some possibility to change attitude. The only problem in that particular case is the reaction of Iran. I mean, we know that if Donald Trump announces that the nuclear deal is over for the Americans, then the response from Tehran could be just reboosting this nuclear program. And this is, of course, something that would be simply leading to a catastrophe, to a disaster in the
If I could,
so Emmanuel Macron,
Mr. Gouvernement, what is the another deal that you are talking about? What is then the bottom line of so-called another deal? What exactly is the bottom line of France? And whether it is this deal or next deal or the one after the next, what is the bottom line?
This is exactly the whole question here. What is the possibility to find something that will make everybody satisfied? I mean, France and the United States are not the only countries that did sign the deal back in 2015. So we have to find, if we do change the deal, something acceptable for Tehran, something acceptable for Moscow, something acceptable for Beijing as well. And I think that Macron knows exactly that by reaching the US president in Washington, the, let's say, plan A is still to convince him not to touch anything and to keep the deal as it is, because yes, it is a good deal.
All right.
But on the other side, if it doesn't work, and if Trump is determined, we must find some common ground.
So I didn't get the exact word coming from you, Mr. Gouvernement, as to what exactly is the bottom line. You said it is still up there to be explored. Okay, let's go to Professor Wang here in Beijing. How do you see the division on the issue of Iran between the United States and France, or shall I say between the United States and some of the European counterparts, even NATO counterparts, about this? Is this going to be the division that is likely to define a very different outlook about diplomacy and about how the world should be run?
Definitely it's a serious test for for United States and the European Union. The nuclear deal made 2015, largely led by European Union, plus Germany, France, and UK. The Europeans seek more a multilateral approach and the diplomatic solutions to the hot issues. But the United States pay less attention to so-called the NPT, given that after the Iranian nuclear issues, they also have the North Korea nuclear issues. So the Europeans, I think about the NPT itself, about the proliferation itself. So U.S. is more thinking about the bilateral relations, they fail to themselves more unilaterally. So this is a serious dispute.
Do you think China will accept that if this Iran deal, which has been hard negotiated over the years, eventually fell off?
Of course, China, I think, share a very similar approach with the European countries. If no nuclear issues of Iran can be renegotiated, what about other issues? And then it's the chaos of the international order.
All right. Well, it is not the first time that President Trump is trying to challenge, quote, the international order. Having said that, though, Mr. Chirac, let me go to you about asking that bottom line. What do you think is the bottom line? Or Mr. President Trump is once again being a merchant, meaning he is trying to use it as a bargaining chip for something else?
Well, possibly. Again, this tactic may be there. I am not sure if it's going to yield success. We shall see, as the president likes to say. You know, we shall see what happens. Clearly, I mean, America has some legitimate concerns, because beyond the nuclear deal, there is the issue of the overall behavior of Iran in the region, which is highly destabilizing. Its interventions in Syria, its support for Hezbollah, its support for the insurrection in Yemen. All these are highly destabilizing activities conducted by the government in Tehran, which have nothing to do and are not covered by the nuclear deal. And then, of course, there's the issue of the development of ballistic missiles, which, again, are not covered by the nuclear deal. But America, if you recall, President Obama had sold the nuclear deal as one way to capture the Iranians and to modify their behavior, not just on nuclear proliferation, but on other areas as well. And that clearly didn't work. Now, has Mr. Trump a strategy whereby putting pressure on Iran on the nuclear deal, he can obtain other concessions in different areas? That would be fantastic.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if it's possible, because, again, that would require the cooperation of all the signatories of that deal, from China to Russia to the European Union, and, of course, France and Britain and Germany as well.
Yes.
That's very difficult.
Professor Wang, so are we going to see the United States challenge every piece of whether legislation, international agreement, or some kinds of historical achievements? If all these things renegotiated, what is the bottom line of the international order? Or actually, the U.S. is saying through this Iran deal that the U.S. is going to decide on the fate of everything, whether it's Iran or it's trade. We haven't even got a chance to talk about trade yet. We're going to go that. You'll see in a second. Professor Wang.
Definitely. Though not about the international security order, but also international economic order as well, like the WTO not works so well, and the U.S. want to increase the tariff in the steel and aluminum, and actually many European countries they seek the exemption from the U.S., but another due time is coming. So Macron also should persuade the United States that continue so-called the exempt and not to continue the tariff war against the European Union. And also the competitive with Germany under the leadership of the European integration. So this is a hard job for Macron.
If you could talk briefly, Mr. Gourmand, what is the bottom line and the principle of an alliance for France with the United States? Is it based on similar values of the world, or is it based on whatever the Americans say? Will this time, when the French president visiting the United States, be a moment to examine what exactly is the principle of this alliance from the French perspective?
Well, this is a very tricky question, especially at this
That's why I asked you, sir. You probably want to give me a direct answer.
We're just a few days. We're just a few days away from this intervention in Syria, and that question was actually raised here in France, whether the legitimacy of this attack was not to be questioned. And of course, the response from Emmanuel Macron was extremely clear, and this is the one I'm giving you now, although it's not particularly my answer. There was a legitimate action because of the values that we do share with our allies, the United States and the United Kingdom in that particular case.
Okay.
So yes, I believe that there is something strong here. But yet, just for you to know, this is a strong debate here in France about the so-called alignment to American values and American foreign policy. So this is indeed something that is not very easy to apprehend and very easy to answer.
Okay, there we go. Mr. Chirac, Mr. Gourmand said it's not easy to tackle. Probably for you it could be easier. What will be the nature of relationship between the European counterparts, France included, and the United States? This is not just about Iran issue, it's also about trade issue and some of the other strategic issues between the two sides. Mr. Chirac.
Absolutely. Well, look, if we look at the post-war period, the alliance between the United States, Canada, and Western Europe was a cornerstone of the international political order, founded on the NATO alliance and a strong connection which gave rise to what people at the time were calling an Atlantic community. An Atlantic community of shared values and shared geopolitical perspective and a shared enemy, which at that time was the Soviet Union. Now, how do we redefine this extremely important relationship between the United States and Europe in the post-Cold War environment, where there is no longer a Soviet threat, at least as defined in the old days, and where there is a web of incredible, trade and economic and financial interest. After all, this is the most important bilateral economic, trade and financial relationship in the world. However, the relationship is frosty. The Europeans don't particularly like this style of American leadership. America does not trust Europe as a whole as a partner on strategic issues in general, and certainly has all kinds of issues on trade. Now, can Macron be the spokesperson of Europe during this important high-profile state visit and try to pour some water into this fire of brewing trade concerns and misalignments?
Well, you know what, Mr. Chirac, when you are asking another question to my earlier question, let me tell you, it seems that earlier the Angela Merkel from Germany have already stated her position on many of the issues. That's why Germany and the United States, at least the current president, seem to not necessarily on a good term. So it is really about whether you want to have a good relationship, quote unquote, or the principle of the relationship, it seems. And I wondered, within the European continent, how would people look at what qualifies as the leadership of the EU, whether it is no principle alliance with the United States or is a principled alliance with the United States. That is certainly or going to be there for observation. Professor Wang, let me ask you, even though China is an outside player in this cross-Atlantic relationship, but Professor Wang, how is China going to read all these messages and informations when these two sides are trying to interacting with one another, whether it is trade, whether it's about world order?
Well, Chinese government now is pursuing so-called the community of the shared future for humankind. It goes beyond the traditional alliance system. The United States and the European Unions actually shared the values before, but now domestic values, international values, actually they are disputed. So this kind of the transatlantic community of the shared values and shared security concerns actually is being tested again and again.
Well, certainly we are going to see another day of negotiation and talk between the two sides, the French president and the U.S. president. We hope something will come out, and that would help us to solve all of the mysteries, gentlemen, as we earlier discussed. For now, I want to thank the three of you for sharing your insights and your perspective. We have Professor Wang Yiwei and Barthélemy Gourmand, as well as Paulo Van Chirac. Thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program today. China celebrates Space Day with big plans for its taikonaut brigade and an eye on the booming space tourism industry. Well, we're going to tackle that issue after this. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Today marks China's third Space Day. China has begun the process of selecting its third batch of taikonaut, or Chinese astronauts, and plans to start assembling its space station in the year 2020. It's scheduled to become fully operational around 2022. Besides China, there are also space entrepreneurs out there with the money and the desire to reach for the stars.
It's been 2 decades since the founding of the Taikonaut Brigade of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. 21 taikonauts have since been recruited in 2 batches. There would be as many as 17 to 18 in the third, while their qualifications and skill sets would differ from previous selections.
The selection process consists of 3 phases, and we will not only select males but also female candidates. The taikonauts will be pilots, maintenance engineers, and payload scientists. The scope will cover not only pilots from the Air Force of People's Liberation Army, but also flight engineers and scientists from related industries, universities, and institutions.
China has long been engaged in space travel. In 2016, China's Long March rocket started its commercial launches for both domestic and overseas clients. China's suborbital space travel, which could spur space tourism, is expected to take off around the year 2025. 50 years after Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to go on a space flight, worldwide commercial companies appear to be on the cusp of a booming space tourism industry. One of them is Jeff Bezos, who started Blue Origin and launched the spacecraft with the biggest window, while Virgin Galactic accomplished a supersonic test flight. Elon Musk co-founded SpaceX and blasted off on its highly anticipated maiden test flight using SpaceX's Falcon Heavy in February this year. That marks one more successful step in the Mars colonization plan.
You could imagine large numbers of those just coming in, landing, taking off, landing, doing many flights per day.
Private space travel is an emerging industry that is changing the way people view the universe. In the last 2 decades, a few adventurous billionaires began investing in it. Russia already sent 7 rich people to space for tourism. Space travel for the masses may no longer be a shot in the dark, thanks to rapid advancements in aerospace technology.
For more on space tourism, we're joining in our Beijing studio Yang Yuguang, who is a professor at the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation. Welcome, sir.
Good evening.
Houston, in the U.S., we have Leroy Chiao, who is a former NASA astronaut and International Space Station commander. Welcome as well. I want to begin with you, Mr. Chiao. Commercial flights to the outer space. What exactly is the current stage? Can we really see the success that some of the big names, in a way, in the industry has promised us? Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos.
Right. Well, so, you know, Spaceship One was the first private effort. Oops, we've lost the signal. Getting a dial tone.
All right, we're going to come back to you later. And now let me go to...
I don't know if you can still hear me.
Let me go to Yang Yuguang. I can hear you, certainly, but I don't know whether you can hear me. So, Mr. Yang, let's go with you first. Let's go with a question about China. Today is China's Space Day. So, China is preparing another batch of taikonauts, meaning Chinese astronauts. Is China's effort more state-run effort, or is it going to be overall efforts coming from both the state and also the private sector, as well as from other factors of the society?
The answer is both. You know that the current space program, especially the manned space program, is led by the government. But you know that in the recent years, the private sector in space field is developing very fast.
Give me an example.
So in the future, maybe it is possible for the private sector to also entering the field like the manned space flight. Today, we also have many partners in private companies who have already do many contributions to China's manned space program. And also, what you mentioned today during the third Space Day of China, we mentioned that we will select the third batch of astronauts. You know that in the years before, we selected astronauts who will be qualified to be the pilots of the spaceships. But in the future, we will also have mission specialists and also payload experts. In these kind of purposes, the requirement to the astronaut will be greatly reduced. So they don't need to have the capability to driving the spaceship. But still, because you know that during the taking off and during the landing, the spaceship has very crucial conditions. They also need to adapt that.
When you say in the future, what kind of future are you talking about, and how far is the future are we referring to, Mr. Yang?
Well, you know that China will construct its space station before the year 2020 or 2022. After construction of the space station, we will have the more scientific research on board the space station.
And that is the time.
Yeah.
Exactly. So let me have Mr. Chiao now. Can you hear me, sir, right now?
Yes, I'm back.
Wonderful. What do you make of China's space development right now? As we mentioned earlier in our background, the third batch of taikonauts or Chinese astronauts are actually already being assembled, and they are likely to take on new missions. So can the two countries, China and the United States, has an opportunity to cooperate? As we have seen, there are fewer and fewer areas, it seems, that the two countries are really working closely together over the past 1 year, to say the least. So do you think that could be an opportunity?
Right. So first of all, I think that China is making very steady progress in their space exploration program, particularly on the human spaceflight side. It's been a deliberate program with each mission doing a little more and more and doing new things. And it's interesting to see that China is now selecting its third astronaut class, and which will include, logically, people from outside of the military, including researchers, people from universities, institutes, and things like that. And that makes sense because China is about to begin construction of their space station, and you're going to need these specialists to operate aboard the station. So as far as the commercial side goes, you know, I think there is opportunity, but as I was saying before, I think we need to be a little cautious because we were over-optimistic back in the early 2000s. As for international cooperation, I've been a big advocate of the U.S. and China working together, in fact, all the international partners. And so my hope is that we can work together, the two countries, in at least a civil space program, because that, in our experience, for example, working with Russia, has brought the two countries' relationships better in all areas. So that is my hope.
Well, working with Russia to a certain extent, within certain time frame, yes, it did work. Professor Yang, what about that possibility? China and the United States cooperation in the space field, we also see there's already a dispute when it comes to the chips. If the chips become difficult, will space cooperation become a possibility?
Well, you may review the history. During the 1990s, China and the United States do have many cooperations, especially the China provides the launch services for the U.S. satellites. But after the millennium, this kind of cooperation, we can seldom see that because the limitation raised by the U.S. Congress. But in recent years, you know that I met many of my friends in international space field, and all my friends from the United States expressed their wish, including Dr. Leroy Chao, the wish to cooperate with China.
But these are technicians and also space people themselves. They are not policymakers. They are not the difficult part. They're actually very much for cooperation, as Mr. Chao just mentioned.
Because you know that in 2014, I met Dr. Charles Bolden in Toronto, and he also expressed his wish to cooperate with China. But he said, first step, I should convince the Congress. Although that he's already retired, but still, many of my friends from NASA also expressed their wish to cooperate with China.
So in the professional fields from both sides, there is a very strong desire of cooperation.
Absolutely.
But of course, political issues could be one of those difficult parts.
In fact, we already have some breakthrough. You know that last year, a Chinese scientific instrument has already on board the International Space Station. This is an instrument made by the Beijing Institute of Technology, led by Professor Deng Yulin, and with the help of NanoRacks. I also have some friends from NanoRacks. They have provided this kind of services and do not have any conviction of the laws of the United States.
What exactly is the function of this machine?
This is a biological experiment, and the samples have been brought back by the Dragon spaceship.
I think we did some programs about that discussion, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Chao, what about the other thing? If international cooperation in China and the United States could be difficult, could there be a door open if it is not state-to-state cooperation? If it is coming from the private sector? For example, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk working with Chinese side on some of the future projects. I don't know whether that could be a possibility. I'm just throwing it out and for you to discuss.
Absolutely, and so on the commercial side, there is definitely more leeway. However, U.S. laws right now, specifically what we call the ITAR laws, prohibit any U.S. citizen from transferring any technology or knowledge about anything related to aerospace without a license, without a specific license from the U.S. government. So in theory, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk and their companies, they could work with Chinese entities, but they would have to get licensed from the U.S. government to work specifically with those entities. So it's a possibility, but it's not easy. But probably easier to do that than right now in the current environment, particularly on the U.S. Congress side of the working state to states. Now, you know, Yang Yuguang brought up a good point. We had Charlie Bolden, who was our administrator and a friend of mine. He was very much in favor of working with China. President Barack Obama was also in favor of working with China, particularly in space, and it was a few members of the U.S. Congress that were able to effectively block any effort towards that goal
right.
for the entire 8 years of President Obama's administration. So you very, very correctly point out it's really a political question and really up to policymakers to try to figure this out.
All right. If that is a difficult issue to figure out, let's put it aside. Isn't it? I mean, this is the ancient wisdom. If you have difficulties, to put it aside and talk about something that is possible. So let's, gentlemen, with your brilliant minds, let's talk about something that is possible. About the commercial flights into the outer space. Mr. Chow, how much do you think responsibility and also in terms of technology development, in terms of carrying people to the outer space, the private sector could carry? And what is going to be the labor of division between, let's just say, the so-called state side and the private side? We understand there's $350 billion when it comes to the industry development, the outer space industry development. So how is that likely to be divided?
Well, of course, there will always be a separation, I think, between government space programs and, of course, commercial space programs. They have very different goals. What is interesting is for the first time you're seeing companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin actually having visionary leaders who want to do exploration, who want to build space infrastructure. And so that's really a departure from the classic model where the commercial companies merely build things under contract for the U.S. government. And so that's very exciting because, for example, Elon Musk wants to colonize Mars. Jeff Bezos wants to build infrastructure around the Earth and around the Moon in order to spur other industries in space. And so this is a very interesting time we're living in, I think.
Mr. Yang, though, to what extent do you think these companies will be able to advance some of the most important technologies when it comes to outer space exploration, or it is only for tourism alone? Meanwhile, do we have commonly shared rules when it comes to tourism from the into the outer space? Will that become a big issue once we got more tourists into the outer space?
You know that for a launch vehicle which can carry a man into space, we call it a human-rated launch vehicle. It has more higher reliability requirement to this kind of launch vehicle than common rockets. So in the future, I still think that it is still a very long way for the private sector to satisfy this kind of requirement.
What about the common rules? Is there common rules about the outer space, Mr. Yang? Could that be also a tricky point among countries?
I think this is also possible because you know that in the future this kind of rules is also discussed by the those who study the space laws and other regulations and these kind of issues.
Mr. Chow, what do you make of it? I mean, for now, the outer space ownership is the world, right? It is shared by everybody, and therefore everybody has equal rights to explore it. But how those who have access to the outer space, particularly through tourism, is likely to explore it, and whether it's going to have an impact on others' possibility to do the same, will be a big question.
That's true, and everything right now is run by treaty, which countries have all signed up. Not all, but the spacefaring nations have all signed up for, where nobody can actually own the moon. It's a little bit like the Antarctic. We can have research stations there, we can go do things there, but nobody can claim it and own it. And so that's the state of affairs now. And I think as we evolve into more commercial activities, we will see that the natural evolution will be the regulations and further treaties that will have to be agreed upon by the spacefaring countries. So that's a very good point.
And also the safety of the tourists. That, of course, is a big, big issue. We also learned about certain tragedies over the years when preparing for these trips. So, Mr. Yang, what about that?
Well, that's we've talked to this topic before. You know that the balance between safety and low cost is always a conflict. So the only thing we can do is to how well we keep it. For the commercial space companies, the problem that it seems that people like Elon Musk care more about the low cost. But for a human space flight, I should always emphasize that the safety comes first.
Mr. Chow?
Right, and I absolutely agree. It is a balance. It's you know, very much like commercial airplanes and airliners. Of course, the desire is to make it as safe as possible. You're never going to make it 100% safe, but at the same time, you know, you can only get it to a certain point where you still is commercially viable. And so I think you find that balance very much like the commercial airline industry has found it.
Leroy Chow and Yang Yu Guang, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Really appreciate it. And happy Space Day. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.